The champagne glasses clinked together one last time before everything changed forever. It was October 15th, 1994, and Manhattan's elite were celebrating another successful charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. Among them stood Vincent Morrison, a 45-year-old real estate mogul whose smile was as polished as his Italian leather shoes. By morning, that smile would be nothing more than a haunting memory frozen in newspaper photographs. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Vincent Morrison lived the kind of life most people only dreamed about. His penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue overlooked Central Park, where the autumn leaves painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee and expensive cologne as Vincent prepared for what would become the most ordinary day of an extraordinary disappearance. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Vincent's housekeeper, Maria Santos, knocked on his bedroom door with his usual breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee served on bone china that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had worked for the Morrison family for 12 years and knew his routine better than he did. Vincent always emerged from his room at 7:35, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, his silver hair combed back with just enough gel to catch the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But that morning felt different. Maria would later tell police that something in Vincent's eyes seemed distant, almost haunted. He barely touched his breakfast, and when she asked if everything was all right, he simply nodded and murmured something about taking care of old business. The phrase would echo in her mind for decades to come. The sounds of the city below created their usual symphony: taxi horns blaring, construction crews hammering away at yet another skyscraper, and the distant rumble of the subway carrying millions of people to their daily routines. Vincent stood at his window, watching the ant-like figures move through the streets 30 floors below. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had everything money could buy, yet his eyes revealed something money couldn't fix. At 9:15 a.m., Vincent's driver, Thomas Mitchell, pulled up to the building in the pristine black Mercedes-Benz that Vincent insisted be washed every morning. Thomas had been driving for the Morrison family since 1987 and prided himself on punctuality. Vincent usually appeared in the lobby at exactly 9:20, briefcase in hand, ready to conquer another day in the ruthless world of New York real estate. But 9:20 came and went. Then 9:25. Then 9:30. Thomas called up to the penthouse, but there was no answer. Maria checked every room twice, her heart pounding louder with each empty space she discovered. The shower was dry. The bed was made. Vincent Morrison had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and a half-eaten piece of toast that would become evidence in one of New York's most baffling missing persons cases. What nobody knew that morning was that Vincent's disappearance would remain unsolved for 30 years, until a construction crew would stumble upon a hidden bunker that would reveal secrets dark enough to shake the very foundations of Manhattan's elite society. But what really happened in those final moments before Vincent Morrison walked out of his life forever? The emergency dispatch call came in at 11:47 a.m., 43 minutes after Detective Sarah Chen had finished her second cup of coffee and started what she thought would be another routine Tuesday. The voice on the other end belonged to Maria Santos, and despite her 12 years of composed service to the Morrison family, her words trembled with an anxiety that made seasoned officers take notice. Detective Chen arrived at the Fifth Avenue building as the autumn sun cast long shadows through the lobby's crystal chandeliers. The doorman, Harold Fitzpatrick, stood wringing his hands near the marble reception desk, his usually pristine uniform slightly wrinkled from nervous fidgeting. He had been working the morning shift for 15 years and prided himself on knowing every tenant's schedule down to the minute. The elevator's brass doors opened with a soft chime that seemed inappropriately cheerful given the circumstances. As Chen stepped into Vincent Morrison's penthouse, the first thing that struck her was the absolute perfection of everything. Not a single cushion out of place, not a speck of dust on the mahogany furniture, not even a water ring on the glass coffee table. It was as if the apartment had been staged for a magazine photo shoot, rather than lived in by a human being. Maria Santos sat in the kitchen, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Her dark eyes held the kind of worry that comes from truly caring about someone, not just working for them. She had raised 3 children of her own while keeping the Morrison household running like clockwork, and her maternal instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. The master bedroom told its own story. The king-sized bed was made with military precision, hospital corners sharp enough to cut glass. Vincent's walk-in closet revealed rows of identical suits arranged by color, each one pressed and ready for battle in the corporate world. But there was something missing that Chen couldn't quite put her finger on, something that made the space feel hollow despite its obvious wealth. Thomas Mitchell paced the building's underground garage like a caged animal. His black Mercedes sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, engine cold, waiting for a passenger who would never come. In 27 years of professional driving, he had never been stood up, never left wondering where his employer had gone. The routine had been sacred, unbreakable, until today. By afternoon, Chen had interviewed every staff member, every doorman from the 3 shifts, and every resident who might have seen something unusual. The building's security footage showed Vincent entering the lobby at 11:23 p.m. the previous night, taking the elevator to his penthouse floor, and then nothing. No footage of him leaving, no record of any other elevator activity. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the expensive air of his own home. The first red flag came when Chen tried to reach Vincent's business partner, Richard Blackwood. Morrison and Blackwood Real Estate had been Manhattan's most successful development firm for over a decade, built on Vincent's vision and Richard's ruthless business acumen. But Richard's secretary claimed he was out of town on business, unreachable, and had been for the past week. The timing felt too convenient, too clean. As darkness fell over Manhattan, search teams combed through Central Park, while forensic specialists dusted every surface in the penthouse for clues that didn't exist. Vincent Morrison had vanished without leaving so much as a fingerprint out of place, and the growing dread in Chen's stomach told her that this was just the beginning of something much darker than a simple missing person case. What was Vincent Morrison hiding in those final hours? And why did everyone around him seem to be lying about something they couldn't quite name? The Morrison and Blackwood offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a steel needle. Detective Chen arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, 48 hours after Vincent Morrison's disappearance, carrying with her the growing certainty that this case was about to become much more complicated than anyone had imagined. Richard Blackwood's corner office smelled of expensive leather and barely concealed panic. Despite his secretary's claims about being unreachable, Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect silver hair showed traces of nervous fingers running through it, and his trademark confident smile seemed forced, plastic, desperate. The partnership between Morrison and Blackwood had built an empire worth over $200 million, transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums and turning forgotten neighborhoods into playgrounds for the wealthy. But as Chen studied the financial documents spread across Richard's desk, patterns began to emerge that painted a very different picture of their success. Vincent's personal assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had worked for the company for 8 years and knew where every skeleton was buried. Her nervous energy filled the reception area as she sorted through files with shaking hands, occasionally glancing toward Richard's office as if expecting something terrible to emerge. When Chen questioned her about Vincent's recent behavior, her carefully rehearsed answers cracked just enough to reveal genuine fear underneath. The company's books told a story that Vincent Morrison's public persona had tried desperately to hide. Beneath the glamorous real estate deals and charity galas lay a web of questionable transactions, offshore accounts, and partnerships with shell companies that existed only on paper. Money flowed in and out of accounts like water through a broken dam, leaving behind traces of something that looked suspiciously like money laundering. Chen discovered that Vincent had been meeting regularly with a man named Anthony Russo, whose business card listed him as an import-export consultant, but whose background check revealed connections to some of New York's most dangerous families. The meetings had been taking place in a small restaurant in Little Italy, always on Thursday evenings, always in a back booth where conversations couldn't be overheard. The restaurant's owner, Salvatore Benedetti, served the best linguine alle vongole in the city and claimed to know nothing about Vincent Morrison's visits. But his hands shook slightly as he cleaned glasses that were already spotless, and his eyes darted toward the back booth where Vincent had held his secret meetings. The lingering smell of garlic and fear created an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. Security footage from the restaurant's exterior camera revealed Vincent entering the establishment on the evening of October 13th, 2 days before his disappearance. But the tape showed something else that made Chen's blood run cold. Vincent had left the restaurant at 9:47 p.m., looking over his shoulder, walking faster than usual, clutching a manila envelope against his chest like it contained his life savings. Back at the precinct, Chen spread crime scene photos across her desk, under the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look sterile and unforgiving. Vincent's penthouse had been too perfect, too clean, too staged. Real people left traces of their lives everywhere they went. Coffee rings, wrinkled clothes, forgotten newspapers. But Vincent's home had been wiped clean of any evidence that a human being actually lived there. The breakthrough came when Chen decided to examine Vincent's personal effects more carefully. Hidden in his bedroom safe, behind stacks of bearer bonds and family photographs, she found a safety deposit box key that didn't match any account at Vincent's known banks. The key was old, brass, and carried the logo of a small private bank in Queens that catered to clients who valued discretion above all else. What secrets was Vincent Morrison willing to die for, and who else knew about the contents of that mysterious safety deposit box? The Queens Private Trust Bank sat wedged between a laundromat and a bodega on Northern Boulevard, its modest facade deliberately unremarkable in a neighborhood where anonymity was worth more than marble columns. Detective Chen arrived on a gray Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Vincent Morrison had vanished, carrying court orders and the growing weight of a case that seemed to twist deeper with every revelation. The bank manager, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, had been guarding other people's secrets for 32 years. Her small office smelled of old paper and mint tea, and her pale blue eyes held the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen enough to never be surprised again. She examined Chen's paperwork with the thoroughness of a surgeon, her arthritic fingers tracing each legal seal with methodical precision. The safety deposit box vault descended into the building's basement, where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the air carried the metallic taste of old fear. Box 247 had been rented by Vincent Morrison for 15 years under an alias, Jonathan Miller, complete with falsified identification that had fooled even the bank's stringent verification processes. When the dual locks clicked open and Chen lifted the heavy metal lid, the contents seemed to mock the sterile environment around them. Stacks of photographs, audio cassettes labeled with dates and initials, and documents that would have sent shockwaves through Manhattan's power structure lay organized with the same obsessive precision that had characterized Vincent's penthouse. The photographs told a story that Chen's veteran instincts had been dreading to discover. Images of construction sites at night, trucks unloading unmarked cargo, meetings in parking garages between men whose faces belonged on FBI wanted posters. Vincent Morrison hadn't just been a real estate developer. He had been documenting a criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of New York's political and business elite. One audio cassette, labeled October 10, 1994, contained a conversation that made Chen's hands tremble as she held the tiny recorder. Vincent's voice, clear and determined, negotiating with someone whose identity was masked by electronic distortion. They discussed shipments, schedules, and payments that had nothing to do with legitimate real estate development. The recording ended abruptly, with Vincent saying 5 words that would haunt Chen for years to come. "I have enough to bury everyone." The documents revealed a conspiracy that stretched back over a decade. Construction contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper, environmental reports falsified to hide toxic waste disposal, and political contributions that bought silence and cooperation from officials who were supposed to protect the public. Vincent had been keeping meticulous records of every crime, every payoff, every threat made against anyone who asked too many questions. But the most chilling discovery lay at the bottom of the box. A handwritten letter addressed to whoever finds this first. Vincent's elegant handwriting, the same script that had signed million-dollar contracts, now documented his growing fear that his partners had discovered his secret documentation project. The letter read like the confession of a man who knew he was living on borrowed time. The final page of the letter contained a crude map sketched in Vincent's hand, showing the location of what he called the real evidence, something hidden in a place where no one would think to look for it. The map showed landmarks that Chen recognized as being in the industrial district of Queens, near the docks where cargo containers arrived daily from around the world. As Chen sealed the evidence bags and prepared to leave the bank vault, Mrs. Kowalski's carefully maintained neutrality cracked just enough to reveal genuine concern. She had watched Vincent Morrison visit his safety deposit box every month for 15 years, and in recent visits, he had looked like a man being hunted by ghosts he had created himself. The elevator ride to the surface felt like ascending from a tomb filled with secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. Chen realized that Vincent Morrison's disappearance wasn't just a missing person case, it was the opening chapter of a war between a man with a conscience and an organization that had turned murder into just another business expense. But who had discovered Vincent's betrayal first? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried alongside their former partner? The industrial waterfront of Queens stretched along the East River like a graveyard of America's manufacturing dreams. Detective Chen arrived at dawn, Vincent Morrison's hand-drawn map clutched in her gloved hand, while tugboats pushed barges through waters that reflected the orange glow of sodium streetlights like liquid copper. The map led to Pier 47, a seemingly abandoned dock facility that had once processed cargo from ships arriving from South America and the Caribbean. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and the salt air carried the mixed scents of rust, rotting wood, and something else, something that made Chen's trained instincts scream warnings she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Vincent's crude sketch showed a warehouse marked with an X, building number 1247, which stood among a cluster of similar structures that looked identical in their decay. But as Chen approached the building, details began to separate it from its neighbors. Fresh tire tracks in the mud led to loading docks that were supposedly unused, and security cameras mounted on rusted posts looked far too new for an abandoned facility. The warehouse's exterior showed decades of weather damage, but the lock on the main entrance was modern, expensive, and recently installed. Chen's lockpick skills, learned during her early years working undercover, made quick work of the mechanism, and the heavy door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo off the water. Inside, the warehouse was divided into sections that told the story of Vincent Morrison's deepest fears. The main floor had been converted into a sophisticated documentation center, complete with photography equipment, filing cabinets, and map tables covered with aerial photographs of construction sites throughout Manhattan and Queens. But it was the photographs pinned to a massive bulletin board that made Chen's stomach drop. Images of Vincent meeting with Anthony Russo, Richard Blackwood shaking hands with known crime bosses, trucks unloading at construction sites in the dead of night, and politicians receiving briefcases full of what was obviously cash. Vincent had been building a case that could have brought down half of New York's power structure. The center of the bulletin board held a photograph that changed everything Chen thought she knew about the case. Vincent Morrison and Richard Blackwood stood on either side of a man whose face had been burned into her memory during her years in the organized crime unit. Carmine, the Cement Torino, head of one of the 5 families that had controlled New York's construction industry for decades. Audio equipment scattered throughout the warehouse revealed Vincent's methodical approach to gathering evidence. Dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with dates, locations, and initials, documented meetings where construction contracts were awarded based on violence rather than competitive bidding. Vincent had been wearing a wire to meetings with his own business partner, recording conversations that would have gotten him killed if discovered. The back section of the warehouse contained Vincent's backup plan: passports with false identities, cash in multiple currencies, and airline tickets to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Vincent Morrison had been preparing to disappear, but someone had discovered his betrayal before he could execute his escape. Chen found Vincent's final message in a sealed envelope taped to the underside of a desk drawer. The letter was dated October 14th, one day before his disappearance, and written in the shaky handwriting of a man who knew his time was running out. They know about the warehouse. Richard has been feeding them information for months. If something happens to me, look for the bunker beneath Morrison Tower. The real evidence is there. Evidence that will destroy them all. The letter ended with coordinates and a cryptic reference to the foundation of lies. As Chen pocketed the evidence, she realized that Vincent Morrison hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced before he could expose a conspiracy that reached the very heart of New York's construction empire. What had Vincent hidden in the bunker beneath his own building, and who else knew about its existence? Morrison Tower stood 47 stories above Manhattan, its gleaming facade reflecting the afternoon sun like a monument to American capitalism. Detective Chen arrived with a team of forensic specialists, and the sinking realization that Vincent Morrison's disappearance was about to uncover secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. The building's basement levels required special access cards that only Vincent and Richard Blackwood possessed. But Vincent's final letter had included a detailed schematic showing a hidden entrance through the parking garage behind what appeared to be a maintenance panel but was actually a sophisticated security door. The coordinates led to sub-level B4, deeper than the building's official blueprints indicated. As Chen descended the concrete stairwell, the air grew colder and carried the metallic taste of fear mixed with something else, the lingering scent of fresh cement and industrial-grade bleach that suggested recent construction work. The hidden bunker stretched beneath Morrison Tower like a subterranean command center designed by someone who understood that knowledge was the most dangerous weapon in New York City. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each one locked and labeled with codes that referenced construction projects dating back 15 years. But it was the photographs covering every available wall space that revealed the true scope of Vincent Morrison's documentation project. Images of concrete trucks dumping loads into the East River under cover of darkness, construction workers pouring foundations around objects that definitely weren't building materials, and city inspectors accepting briefcases full of cash to approve projects that violated every safety code. Vincent's desk contained a journal that read, like the confession of a man watching his American dream transform into a nightmare of corruption and murder. Each entry documented another compromise, another decision to look the other way, another step deeper into a criminal enterprise that had turned construction sites into crime scenes. The most damning evidence lay in a vault that Vincent had built behind a false wall. Concrete samples, soil tests, and photographs that showed Morrison and Blackwood had been disposing of toxic waste by mixing it into the foundations of luxury apartment buildings throughout Manhattan. Thousands of residents were living above graves filled with industrial poison. Chen discovered Vincent's final entry in the journal, dated October 14th, the day before his disappearance. "They're planning to kill me tonight. Richard thinks I don't know about the meeting, but I've been recording everything. If they succeed, my death will be just another foundation in their empire of lies." The bunker's security system revealed that someone had accessed the space at 3:17 a.m. on October 15th, just hours after Vincent's disappearance. The timestamp matched perfectly with the window when Vincent could have been murdered. But who had known about the bunker's existence? And what had they taken from Vincent's collection of evidence? Richard Blackwood's office felt different when Detective Chen returned the next morning. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, and Richard's hands shook as he poured coffee from an expensive machine that seemed obscenely cheerful given the circumstances surrounding his missing business partner. The security footage from Morrison Tower told a story that Richard couldn't explain away with nervous laughter and concerned expressions. At 3:15 a.m. on October 15th, Richard's keycard had been used to access the building's lower levels. The timestamp placed him in the basement during the exact window when someone had broken into Vincent's secret bunker. Chen spread the bunker photographs across Richard's mahogany desk like tarot cards, revealing an inevitable future. Each image showed another crime, another cover-up, another decision that had led to this moment of reckoning. Richard's face went pale as he recognized construction sites where he had personally supervised the disposal of evidence that was never supposed to be found. The partnership between Morrison and Blackwood had been built on shared guilt rather than shared vision. Vincent's journal entries, now evidence in a federal investigation, documented how Richard had been the first to suggest mixing toxic waste into building foundations. The cost savings had been enormous, the environmental impact devastating, and the moral compromises absolute. But Richard's betrayal had gone deeper than environmental crimes. Phone records revealed that he had been in regular contact with Carmine Torino for over 2 years, providing information about Vincent's growing conscience and his dangerous documentation project. Richard had been playing both sides, taking money from the mob while pretending loyalty to his increasingly uncomfortable business partner. The confrontation came when Chen presented Richard with audio recordings from Vincent's bunker, his own voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing the elimination of his business partner with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch. Richard had been planning Vincent's murder for months, waiting for the perfect moment when Vincent's evidence collection would be complete enough to implicate everyone except himself. "You killed him," Chen said, her words cutting through the expensive air of Richard's corner office like shards of broken glass. Richard's composed facade finally cracked, revealing the desperate man underneath who had sold his soul to maintain a lifestyle that demanded constant feeding. His confession came in fragments, each admission more damning than the last, as if the weight of carrying Vincent's death had finally become too much to bear alone. Vincent Morrison had been murdered on the night of October 14th, killed by his own business partner in the basement of Morrison Tower, after discovering Richard's plan to frame him for all their crimes. But Vincent's body wasn't the only thing Richard had hidden in the building's foundation. The real question wasn't who had killed Vincent Morrison. It was where Richard Blackwood had buried the evidence that could still destroy them all. What had Richard done with Vincent's body? And how many other secrets were hidden in the concrete beneath Manhattan's most expensive real estate? The construction crew arrived at Morrison Tower before dawn, their jackhammers and excavation equipment creating a symphony of destruction that echoed through Manhattan's sleeping streets. Detective Chen watched from the sidewalk as ground-penetrating radar equipment mapped the building's foundation, searching for anomalies that Richard Blackwood's confession had promised they would find. The basement of Morrison Tower had been poured in sections over several years, each layer of concrete documenting another phase of Vincent and Richard's descent into criminal enterprise. But one section, poured on October 16, 1994, just one day after Vincent's disappearance, showed readings that didn't match the surrounding foundation. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the forensic anthropologist brought in to supervise the excavation, had seen enough crime scenes to recognize the signs of a body disposed of in concrete. The chemical composition was wrong, the density irregular, and the patterns suggested that something organic had been mixed into the cement before it hardened into Vincent Morrison's tomb. The first breakthrough came when jackhammers hit fabric, expensive wool that matched the description of the suit Vincent had been wearing on his final night alive. But as the excavation continued, the construction crew uncovered something that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Vincent Morrison wasn't alone in his concrete grave. 3 additional bodies emerged from the foundation, each one wrapped in plastic and positioned with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. Dental records would eventually identify them as Anthony Torino, Carmine's nephew, Strudin Tunferthiatoretsend, Maria Castellano, a city inspector who had been asking too many questions, CD Fitau Fidapuatanawens, and James Wheeler, an environmental lawyer who had been investigating illegal dumping in the East River. Each victim represented someone who had posed a threat to the Morrison and Blackwood empire, and each had disappeared without a trace over the past 5 years. Vincent Morrison hadn't just been murdered. He had been added to a collection of inconvenient people who had been silenced and entombed beneath one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses. The construction crew found Vincent's briefcase buried with him, its contents preserved in plastic bags that had kept moisture and time from destroying evidence that would have exposed the entire criminal enterprise. Financial records, photographs, and audio recordings that provided a complete map of corruption, stretching from City Hall to the offices of New York's most powerful construction companies. But the most chilling discovery came last. A handwritten note in Vincent's pocket, written in his final moments as Richard Blackwood prepared to murder him in the basement of their shared empire. I thought I could use their money to build something beautiful. Instead, I helped them build a monument to everything ugly about the American dream. Richard Blackwood's confession had been just the beginning. The foundation of Morrison Tower contained evidence of a conspiracy that had turned Manhattan's construction boom into a decades-long crime spree, with bodies buried beneath buildings where families now slept peacefully, unaware of the graves supporting their homes. How many other buildings had been constructed on foundations of murder? And who else had been profiting from New York's most expensive burial ground? The arrest of Richard Blackwood sent shockwaves through Manhattan's elite circles. But for Detective Chen, it was just the first domino in a line that stretched all the way to City Hall. The evidence from Vincent Morrison's concrete tomb had exposed a criminal enterprise that made traditional organized crime look like a neighborhood book club. Carmine, the cement, Torino, sat in the federal courthouse holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled from a night of processing and interrogation. For 30 years, he had run construction rackets through legitimate businesses. But Vincent Morrison's evidence had documented every payoff, every threat, every murder that had built his concrete empire. The wire recordings from Vincent's bunker revealed conversations that implicated half of New York's city council in a corruption scheme that had approved building permits for structures built on toxic foundations. Environmental inspectors had been bought, safety reports falsified, and anyone who asked too many questions had found themselves becoming part of the foundation they were investigating. Federal agents raided 17 different construction companies simultaneously, seizing records that showed the true scope of the conspiracy. Morrison and Blackwood had been just one arm of an operation that had been systematically poisoning Manhattan's soil while building luxury apartments for families who would never know they were living above industrial graveyards. The most shocking revelation came when forensic accountants traced money flows through shell companies and offshore accounts. The toxic waste disposal operation had been generating over $50 million annually. with payments flowing to a network of politicians, inspectors, and business leaders who had turned environmental protection into a profit center for organized crime. Mayor Patricia Hoffman's resignation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered through her attorney as federal agents searched her Park Avenue apartment for evidence of her involvement in the cover-up. Bank records showed deposits that corresponded exactly with the dates when environmental violations had been overlooked, creating a paper trail that connected City Hall directly to the concrete tombs beneath Morrison Tower. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing than municipal corruption. Vincent Morrison's photographs documented construction sites throughout Manhattan where similar disposal operations had been conducted. Ground-penetrating radar teams were deployed to examine the foundations of dozens of buildings, searching for more graves hidden beneath the city's most expensive real estate. The first additional burial site was discovered beneath the Riverside luxury apartments, where 3 more bodies were found mixed into the building's foundation, along with barrels of industrial chemicals that had been leaking into the groundwater for 15 years. Residents were evacuated as hazmat teams tested soil samples that revealed contamination levels high enough to cause cancer in anyone exposed for extended periods. Dr. Sarah Kim, the environmental scientist brought in to assess the contamination, stood in her white protective suit amid the excavation site, her voice muffled by the respirator she needed to avoid breathing the toxic air. "This isn't just murder," she said, gesturing toward the concrete rubble that had once been someone's dream home. "This is environmental terrorism on a scale that could affect generations." The body count continued to rise as excavation teams worked through the night, uncovering a network of concrete graves that stretched beneath Manhattan like a subway system built from human remains. Each body told the same story. Someone had asked too many questions, and the concrete had provided their final answer. But how many more burial sites were hidden beneath New York's skyline, and who else had been profiting from turning the city into one massive crime scene? The FBI command center occupied an entire floor of Federal Plaza, its walls covered with photographs, charts, and evidence that mapped 30 years of systematic corruption throughout New York's construction industry. Agent Rebecca Torres had been investigating organized crime for 15 years, but the scope of the Morrison case exceeded anything she had encountered in her career. The evidence from Vincent Morrison's bunker had triggered the largest federal investigation in New York's history. Over 200 agents were working around the clock to unravel a conspiracy that had involved 3 mayors, dozens of city council members, and construction companies responsible for building over 40% of Manhattan's luxury housing developments. The breakthrough came when forensic investigators discovered Vincent Morrison's master database hidden in an encrypted server farm in New Jersey. The files contained detailed records of every toxic waste disposal, every murdered witness, and every politician who had accepted payment to look the other way. Vincent had been building a case that could have brought down the entire power structure of New York City. Carmine Torino's plea bargain negotiations revealed the true scope of the operation. His organization hadn't just been disposing of toxic waste in building foundations. They had been using construction projects as covers for importing drugs, laundering money, and disposing of witnesses from criminal enterprises throughout the Northeast Corridor. The congressional hearings began on a cold February morning, broadcast live on every major network as senators questioned officials who had allowed Manhattan to become a toxic waste dump disguised as luxury real estate. Environmental Protection Agency administrators resigned in shame, and city planning officials were led away in handcuffs as the scope of their negligence became clear. But the most damning testimony came from Maria Santos, Vincent Morrison's former housekeeper, who had been receiving anonymous payments for 30 years to remain silent about what she had seen in Vincent's penthouse. Her tearful confession revealed that Vincent had been living in constant fear during his final months, sleeping with a gun under his pillow and checking his apartment for listening devices every morning. "He knew they were going to kill him," Maria said, her voice breaking as she spoke into the congressional microphone. He told me that his money was cursed, that everything he had built was resting on graves he had helped dig. The federal investigation had uncovered over 60 bodies buried in building foundations throughout Manhattan, each one representing someone who had posed a threat to the criminal enterprise. Environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, city inspectors, and construction workers who had witnessed too much. All of them silenced and entombed beneath the feet of people living their daily lives. Richard Blackwood's cooperation with federal prosecutors revealed the locations of burial sites in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, expanding the investigation beyond Manhattan into a regional network of concrete graveyards. Construction companies were shut down overnight, and thousands of residents were evacuated from buildings that had been constructed on contaminated foundations. The financial impact reached into the billions as class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of residents who had been unknowingly exposed to toxic chemicals for decades. Insurance companies declared bankruptcy, real estate values plummeted, and Manhattan's construction industry ground to a halt as investigators examined every major project completed since 1980. What had started as a missing person case had become a federal disaster that would reshape how America thought about urban development, environmental protection, and the price of corruption in the concrete jungles where millions of people called home. But Vincent Morrison's story still wasn't complete. The bunker that had started it all was about to reveal its final, most shocking secret. 30 years after Vincent Morrison's disappearance, construction crews were finally demolishing Morrison Tower. The building had become a toxic monument to corruption, and the city had decided that some structures were too cursed to be allowed to stand. But as the demolition reached the sub-basement levels, workers discovered that Vincent's bunker had been hiding one final secret. The hidden chamber lay behind a wall that had been expertly concealed, accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling through darkness for 20 feet before opening into a space that defied explanation. The chamber had been Vincent's final insurance policy, a room that not even Richard Blackwood had known existed. Detective Chen, now retired but serving as a consultant on the ongoing investigation, descended into the chamber with a team of forensic specialists and federal agents. The air was stale but dry, preserved by a ventilation system that had been running automatically for 3 decades, powered by a hidden electrical connection that city inspectors had never discovered. The chamber contained Vincent Morrison's true legacy, a complete archive of criminal activity that stretched far beyond New York City. Wall-to-wall filing cabinets held evidence of toxic waste disposal operations in Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and Boston. Vincent hadn't just been documenting his own crimes. He had been building a comprehensive case against a national network of environmental criminals. But the most shocking discovery was Vincent Morrison himself. His body sat at a desk in the center of the chamber, naturally mummified by the dry air and chemical preservatives he had used to protect his documents. He wore the same suit he had disappeared in 30 years ago, and his hand still gripped a pen he had been using to write his final message. The letter, written in Vincent's increasingly shaky handwriting, revealed that he had faked his own death to complete his documentation project. Richard Blackwood had tried to murder him on October 14, 1994, but Vincent had been wearing a bulletproof vest and had used the attack as an opportunity to stage his own disappearance. He had been living in the hidden chamber for months, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose the entire conspiracy. But something had gone wrong. Vincent's journal entries showed that his air filtration system had malfunctioned, trapping him in the chamber he had built as his salvation. His final entries documented his slow realization that he was going to die alone, surrounded by evidence that would remain hidden until someone found his tomb of secrets. The chamber's walls were covered with photographs that revealed the true scope of the environmental disaster Vincent had helped create. Images of cancer clusters in neighborhoods built on toxic foundations, children with birth defects caused by contaminated groundwater, and families who had died from exposure to chemicals that had been buried beneath their homes. Vincent's final video message, recorded on equipment that had kept running for 30 years, showed a man who had tried to find redemption in documentation. His gaunt face stared into the camera as he explained how his greed had transformed him into an environmental terrorist, and how his guilt had driven him to spend his final months trying to make amends. "I helped poison a generation," Vincent said in the recording, his voice echo through the chamber like the confession of a ghost. "The money was supposed to buy me freedom, but it bought me a prison made of other people's graves." The chamber contained evidence that would expand the federal investigation to include criminal enterprises in 12 states, implicating construction companies, political figures, and organized crime families in an environmental conspiracy that had been operating for over 4 decades. But Vincent Morrison's death in the chamber revealed something even more disturbing. He hadn't been the mastermind behind the conspiracy. The documents showed that he had been just one player in a much larger network, and the real architects of America's toxic burial ground were still operating, still profiting from environmental crimes that continued to claim victims across the country. Who had been pulling the strings behind Vincent Morrison's empire of environmental destruction? And how many more hidden chambers were buried beneath America's cities? The name that appeared repeatedly in Vincent Morrison's hidden files belonged to someone who had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. Senator William Hartley had built his political career on environmental protection, championing legislation that appeared to safeguard American communities while secretly creating loopholes that allowed toxic waste disposal operations to flourish under federal oversight. FBI raids on Senator Hartley's offices in Washington, D.C., uncovered a shadow empire that made Vincent Morrison's operation look like amateur hour. Hartley had been coordinating toxic waste disposal networks across 12 states, using his position on the Environmental Protection Committee to ensure that investigations were misdirected and whistleblowers were silenced before they could expose the truth. The evidence from Vincent's chamber revealed that Senator Hartley had been the true architect of the conspiracy, using construction projects as covers for environmental crimes that had generated over $2 billion in illegal profits. He had recruited businessmen like Vincent Morrison through a combination of bribes, blackmail, and threats, creating a network of complicit partners who believed they were working for local crime families rather than a federal conspiracy. But Hartley's operation had been more sophisticated than traditional organized crime. He had used his government connections to identify industrial waste producers who needed disposal solutions, matching them with construction companies who could hide the evidence in building foundations. The system had been operating like a toxic waste stock exchange, with Hartley collecting commissions on every transaction. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants traced payments through a labyrinth of shell companies and charitable foundations. The Hartley Environmental Foundation had been receiving donations from chemical companies and defense contractors, then using the money to fund construction projects that disposed of their toxic waste while providing tax deductions for environmental protection. Vincent Morrison's recordings revealed phone conversations with Senator Hartley that dated back to 1979, showing how the young businessman had been recruited into the conspiracy after his first construction company had faced bankruptcy. Hartley had offered Vincent a way to save his business, but the price had been his soul and ultimately his life. The most damning evidence came in the form of government documents that Hartley had forged to legitimize illegal disposal operations. Environmental impact studies had been falsified, soil contamination reports had been altered, and public health investigations had been sabotaged by someone with access to the highest levels of federal environmental agencies. But Senator Hartley's network had included more than just construction companies and chemical producers. Vincent's files revealed that medical research facilities, military contractors, and nuclear power plants had all been using the disposal network to hide waste that would have shut down their operations if discovered by legitimate environmental inspectors. The congressional hearings that followed Senator Hartley's arrest revealed a 40-year conspiracy that had affected every major city in America. Toxic waste had been hidden in the foundations of schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, and shopping centers, creating a nationwide public health disaster that had been disguised as urban development. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, a toxicologist brought in to assess the health impact, testified that the contamination had likely caused thousands of cases of cancer, birth defects, and neurological disorders. Entire communities had been unknowingly poisoned by the buildings they lived and worked in, while the perpetrators had been celebrated as successful businessmen and environmental advocates. Senator Hartley's confession, delivered through his attorney as he faced charges that could result in life imprisonment, revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The conspiracy had been funded by foreign governments seeking to weaken American environmental protection while disposing of their own toxic waste on American soil. What had appeared to be domestic organized crime had actually been a form of environmental warfare. The investigation had uncovered not just a criminal conspiracy, but an act of systematic environmental terrorism that had turned America's cities into toxic waste dumps, disguised as the American dream. The true scope of the damage was still being calculated, but preliminary estimates suggested that over 1 million Americans had been exposed to dangerous levels of contamination. Vincent Morrison had died trying to expose a conspiracy that had been destroying American communities for decades, but his sacrifice had finally brought the truth to light. The question that remained was whether America could ever recover from 40 years of systematic environmental poisoning. Was the damage too extensive to repair? And how many other countries had been targeted by similar environmental warfare disguised as economic development? The encrypted communications found in Vincent Morrison's hidden chamber led federal investigators across 3 continents, revealing that the toxic waste disposal conspiracy had been part of a global network orchestrated by foreign industrial cartels, seeking to eliminate their environmental liabilities, while weakening American infrastructure. The trail began with shipping manifests that showed regular cargo deliveries from chemical plants in Eastern Europe and Asia. Containers marked as construction materials that actually contained industrial waste too dangerous to dispose of in their countries of origin. These shipments had been arriving at American ports for over 2 decades, their contents hidden by forged documentation that Senator Hartley's network had legitimized. International law enforcement agencies coordinated simultaneous raids in 12 countries, uncovering a conspiracy that had used America as a dumping ground for toxic waste that would have cost hundreds of billions to dispose of safely in compliance with international environmental treaties. The operation had been funding terrorist organizations, destabilizing governments, and conducting environmental warfare on a scale that redefined national security threats. The most shocking revelation came from communications between Senator Hartley and representatives of the Kozlov Industrial Consortium, a Russian conglomerate that had been disposing of nuclear waste and chemical weapons components in American building foundations. The payments to American conspirators had been a fraction of what safe disposal would have cost, making environmental terrorism one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in history. Vincent Morrison's final documentation project had uncovered evidence that similar operations were occurring throughout NATO countries, with criminal networks in each nation providing disposal services for industrial waste that their governments couldn't legally eliminate. The conspiracy had been undermining environmental protection treaties while generating profits that funded organized crime throughout Europe and Asia. Federal prosecutors working with international partners discovered that the toxic waste disposal network had been responsible for elevated cancer rates in communities throughout the United States, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. The environmental damage extended beyond individual buildings to include contaminated water supplies, agricultural land, and marine ecosystems that had been receiving runoff from disposal sites for decades. The investigation revealed that Vincent Morrison had become aware of the international scope of the conspiracy during his final months in the hidden chamber. His last journal entries documented His growing horror at discovering that his New York operation had been just one node in a global network of environmental criminals who had been systematically poisoning entire populations for profit. But Vincent's most crucial discovery had been the identity of the conspiracy's ultimate architects, a coalition of industrial cartels and intelligence agencies that had been using environmental terrorism as a form of economic warfare. The goal hadn't been just profit, but the systematic weakening of Western economies through long-term public health disasters that would strain medical systems and reduce productivity for generations. The foreign connections explained why so many American officials had been willing to participate in the conspiracy. They hadn't just been taking bribes, they had been recruited as assets in an environmental warfare campaign that had been targeting American infrastructure since the key 1970s. The toxic waste disposal network had been a weapon of mass destruction disguised as a waste management service. International arrest warrants were issued for over 300 individuals across 17 countries, but many of the key figures had already disappeared into countries without extradition treaties. The conspiracy had been designed with built-in escape routes, allowing its architects to vanish while leaving their American partners to face prosecution. The diplomatic implications were staggering. Several allied nations were discovered to have been complicit in the conspiracy, either through official participation or willful ignorance. Trade agreements were suspended, ambassadors were recalled, and the entire framework of international environmental cooperation was restructured to prevent similar operations. Vincent Morrison's death in the hidden chamber had exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but an act of international environmental warfare that had been conducted on American soil for over 40 years. His sacrifice had revealed that some mysteries are too dangerous for their architects to allow them to live, even when they were willing participants in their own destruction. The final question wasn't just who had been responsible for Vincent Morrison's death. It was whether America could survive the long-term consequences of having been used as a toxic waste dump by enemies who had disguised environmental warfare as legitimate business. But even as the international investigation expanded, investigators realized that Vincent Morrison's story contained one final secret that would change everything they thought they understood about his death and his hidden chamber. The forensic examination of Vincent Morrison's body in the hidden chamber revealed something that investigators had missed during their initial discovery. Advanced toxicology tests showed that Vincent hadn't died from equipment malfunction or starvation, as his journal entries had suggested. He had been poisoned with a sophisticated neurotoxin that had been designed to mimic natural death while ensuring that his final months were spent in mental clarity, aware of his approaching death but unable to prevent it. The poison had been administered through his water filtration system, a slow-acting compound that had given Vincent enough time to complete his documentation project while gradually shutting down his nervous system. Someone had wanted him to finish gathering evidence before they killed him, ensuring that his death would coincide with the completion of the most comprehensive criminal case file in American history. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators examined the chamber's construction more closely. The hidden room hadn't been built by Vincent Morrison at all. It had been constructed by Senator Floyd Hartley's network as an elaborate death trap, designed to contain Vincent, while he unwittingly documented evidence that would be used to eliminate all witnesses to the conspiracy. Vincent's escape from Richard Blackwood's murder attempt had been orchestrated by the real architects of the conspiracy. They had allowed him to believe he was hiding while actually imprisoning him in a chamber designed to become his tomb. His months of documentation work had been the final phase of a plan to ensure that all evidence of the toxic waste network would be buried with its most dangerous witness. The revelation explained why the chamber had been so well equipped, and why Vincent's air filtration system had been connected to the building's main power grid. The conspirators had needed him alive long enough to complete his evidence collection, which would then be retrieved after his death and used to eliminate anyone else who posed a threat to their operation. But Vincent Morrison had achieved something his killers hadn't anticipated. His documentation had been so comprehensive, and his hiding place so sophisticated, that the evidence had remained hidden for 30 years, long enough for the statute of limitations to expire on many of the crimes while allowing the environmental damage to reach levels that made denial impossible. Detective Chen stood in the demolished remains of Morrison Tower as construction crews finished clearing the toxic foundation that had been Vincent Morrison's tomb and monument. The investigation had resulted in over 400 arrests across 17 countries, but the environmental damage would take generations to repair, if it could be repaired at all. The final count revealed that toxic waste disposal operations had contaminated over 15,000 buildings across America, exposing nearly 2 million people to dangerous levels of industrial chemicals, radioactive materials, and chemical weapons components. The medical costs alone would reach into the hundreds of billions, while entire neighborhoods would need to be abandoned as uninhabitable. Vincent Morrison's story had begun with the disappearance of a millionaire who seemed to have everything money could buy. But the bunker discovered 30 years later had revealed that his wealth had been built on a foundation of environmental terrorism that had poisoned an entire generation of Americans. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Vincent had spent his final months trying to atone for crimes that had made him rich, only to discover that his confession would be used as a weapon against the very people he was trying to protect. His killers had turned his guilt into a tool for eliminating witnesses while ensuring that the evidence of their crimes would remain hidden until the damage was irreversible. Maria Santos, now in her 70s, attended Vincent's funeral 30 years after his disappearance. She had kept his secret for 3 decades, believing that her silence was protecting him from the men who had threatened his life. Learning that he had been dead all along, trapped in a chamber beneath the building where she had continued to work, had broken something inside her that money could never repair. He was trying to do the right thing, she said, standing beside the grave where Vincent Morrison was finally laid to rest. But sometimes the right thing comes too late to matter. The environmental cleanup would take decades and cost more than the entire conspiracy had generated in profits. Thousands of families would need to be relocated. Medical treatment programs would need to be established for contamination victims, and entire sections of American cities would need to be rebuilt on foundations that weren't made from toxic waste and human remains. But Vincent Morrison's sacrifice had accomplished something that 40 years of environmental legislation had failed to achieve. His documentation had exposed a form of warfare that most people never knew existed, revealing that some battles for America's future were being fought not with bullets and bombs, but with chemicals and concrete that turned homes into weapons of mass destruction. The final entry in Vincent's journal, written just hours before his death, contained a message that would be carved into his gravestone and remembered by investigators who had spent their careers fighting environmental crime. "I thought I was building an empire, but I was really digging graves. The only redemption for a life built on poison is to ensure that the truth survives, even if the truth-teller doesn't." As Detective Chen walked away from the cemetery, she couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent Morrison's story was both an ending and a beginning. The bunker had been discovered, the conspiracy exposed, and justice served. But the damage would outlive everyone who had caused it. A toxic legacy that would claim victims for generations to come. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in the shadows. They're buried in the foundations of the lives we build on top of them.